Section 25 of U.S. Money vs. Corporation Currency, Aldrich Plan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. U.S. Money vs. Corporation Currency, Aldrich Plan, by Alfred Owen CROZIER. Chapter 22. The Octopus. Coming Incorporated Money Monster. See frontispiece. The American Experience Table of Mortality is about 50 years old. It was based on conditions that prevailed a half-century ago. It was devised by a big insurance company that arbitrarily loaded same for its greater safety and profit with figures about one-third higher than actual experience. The figures have not changed. Improved sanitation and knowledge have reduced the average death rate. The actual combined experience table of mortality of the large life insurance companies is about one-third lower than the American table. But the American table has been permanently grafted into the statutes of most states and long has been used as the basis for settling estates, computing the value of dower, life estates of widows, children, and men, and the amount of damages in personal injury cases. If the true expectancy of life at the stated age is in fact a third longer than that in the statute, great injustice is done. Writer has verified the above facts with the opinion of an actuary of one of the largest old-line life insurance companies. Insurance has become a great public necessity. Rates should be equitable and administration honest, impartial, and strictly for the good of policyholders and the public. The highest and most compelling motives have induced millions of people to become regular annual contributors to these funds for the protection of future widows and orphans. Once they start, they must go on steadily, or pay higher rates, and perhaps through ill health be unable to get new insurance at all. The old line companies now have over $16 billion of insurance in force. Their annual income is increased from $187,424,959 in 1890 to $392,358,741 in 1900 to $703,920,542 in 1910, a sum larger than the $701,372,374 that comprised the entire receipts of the federal government in 1911. The Equitable, Mutual Life, New York Life, Prudential, and Metropolitan, 5 big companies controlled by Wall Street, have $9 billion of insurance, 60% of the total. 6,220,036 policies in force. A combined yearly income of $329,176,873 and $2,236,632,312 of assets. The assets of these 5 companies exceed in value the aggregate capital stock of the 7,331 national banks and the entire national debt combined. Every dollar of this immense fund has been paid in as premiums by the people. The total disbursements for all purposes made in 1910 out of the $703,920,542 of income was only $488,781,352, leaving $215,139,190, or nearly one-third, to compound and accumulate. And every year, this unused fund is getting larger. If it continues to increase at past ratio, it will take less than 10 years to draw into this idle insurance fund an amount equal to all money in circulation. Premiums are based on the spurious American table. This collection of a third more than currently needed tends to pile up in Wall Street a vast and increasing portion of the savings and wealth of the people, except that part used for losses and dividends. These dangerously swollen funds are largely under the control of the big interests that dominate the railroads, trusts, large banks, and trust companies, and with the aid of these deposit funds manipulate the stock market and its nearly 30 billions of invested securities for the private gain and great loss of the public that owns these vast insurance and bank deposits. The law now prohibits insurance companies investing these trust funds in stocks, but it is said that millions of dollars instead of being invested in proper bonds and real estate loans are merely deposited in favored banks, thus increasing the loaning power of such banks at least 400% more than the cash so deposited. these loans often being made to the trusts and big stock market operators at nominal interest rates and being used against the public in the frequent bull and bear campaigns. January 1, 1911, the above 5 companies had on deposit in banks and trust companies $35,243,070 in cash, which increased the loaning power of such banks more than $250 million. More than any other agency, life insurance and its excessive premiums, computed by a false table, have helped to make Wall Street the universal money mecca toward which every one of the 3 billion nimble dollars in the United States seems possessed to make its annual pilgrimage of devotion and tribute. Fire insurance companies have over $500 million of accumulated assets and $295,644,715 annual income. Casualty and surety companies help swell the grand total of yearly insurance income to more than $1 billion. This exceeds the national debt. It is greater than the combined capital stock of the 7,331 national banks. If 1 year's insurance receipts was converted into $1 bills, 4 of them could be given to every man, woman, and child in the United States, and there would be enough left so that, if sewed together end to end, they would be long enough to go around the world once at the equator and again by way of the North and South poles. Other potent agencies conspire to ever increase the golden flood that constantly sweeps into Wall Street from every part of the country. The Bell telephone system, now ruled from New York, has a capitalization of $580 million and $53,600,000 cash of liquid assets. It has 5,882,719 stations, handling 22,284,010 messages daily. With 120,311 employees, it controls the Western Union Telegraph with 24,926 offices and $144,264,443 capitalization. The Postal Telegraph also has large business and revenues. The 4 big express companies controlled by Wall Street collect more than $100 million every year, paying 14% to 54% annual dividends. They keep in their treasuries more than $70 million. The United States Steel Corporation has $508,302,500 common stock, $369,281,100 7% preferred, and $596,351,867 of 5% bonds. Total $1,464,935,467. Its net profits made in 10 years exceed $1 billion. It gathers and draws into Wall Street every year an enormous volume of money. It keeps on deposit in banks at least $75 million cash. The Tobacco Trust is said to have $20 million cash on hand, and other trusts a greater or less amount. The Standard Oil interests no doubt command and draw to Wall Street more money than any other trust because they are in one way or another interested in and taking profits from so many different kinds of enterprises. If, as reported, their actual net profits approximate $100 million every 12 months, as much as the average annual net profits of the Steel Trust, then each 10 years this will add to $1 billion to their liquid capital and wealth. In fact, the compounding of interest and excessive profits from multiplying investments and huge speculations made doubly successful and certain because of the command of unlimited bank capital and bank credit may add $1 billion to their resources in 5 to 8 years, and another $1 billion each succeeding like period, the time constantly shortened as profits and capital increase at compound ratio. If these interests continue their policy of buying up control of the banks in various parts of the country, and thus acquire complete control of the proposed National Reserve Association with its limitless powers, the time surely will come when these interests and their allies will be able to clear $1 billion a year, and possibly several times that ultimately, every dollar of which will be paid by the businessmen and producers of the United States. And the evidence is abundant and conclusive that the Aldrich Plan was originated and is being promoted by the Standard Oil interests and their local and foreign affiliations. The capitalization of the industrial combines grew, 1819 to 1908, from $3,784,000,000 to $31,672,000,000. This astonishing development has its headquarters in Wall Street. to which a large portion of the cash revenues are set. Trust growth has injected new problems into American life. These must be met and solved. It will require patience, wisdom, and courage to eliminate the bad and preserve the good, to exterminate the rats without burning the barn. There is little objection to the combinations being big. Big instrumentalities are required to accomplish big things, in a big country with big resources and big-minded, ambitious men, and these instruments must be in corporate form. No individual could supply all the capital. In a co-partnership, each partner is liable without limit for joint debts. In an ordinary corporation, a stockholder is liable only for the amount he has invested. The almost universal incorporation of industry is due to the desire for permanency and to limit individual liability. A corporation's life, unlike the human, is not liable any day to end. Practically speaking, a corporation is immortal, yet it has no soul. The general incorporation of all business tends to eliminate much of the personal or human element, substituting an inanimate, driving, everlasting, heartless machine with matter-of-fact cogs and wheels and levers in cold metallic, selfish, sordid, and in its operations often criminal. There is but one way to put a soul into a corporation. If the law will impose adequate fine and imprisonment upon each consenting officer and director, whenever their corporation does an illegal or improper act, the whole attitude of the corporations toward the public and their entire course of business will be changed and improved, and more than half of all corporate evils and abuses instantly will disappear. It is wholly impractical for government to fix the prices of numberless trust products. It would quickly lead to government regulation of wages, general government ownership, and Operation State Socialism. Nor can trusts be left free to extort excessive prices from people with the power of monopoly. There is a middle course, simple, easy, practicable, and just to both the corporations and public. Congress has power to regulate or suppress corporations engaging in interstate commerce that become or attempt to become monopolies, or even partial monopolies. It should, by law, take from such corporations every special advantage and profit obtained through the use of power of monopoly. All excessive profits due to monopoly should be confiscated by law and returned to the people through the public treasury. Trusts by law must be divorced from each other, from railroads, banks, Wall Street, and politics. If this is done thoroughly and honestly, trust can be made a blessing to the country. If this is not done, trust must be exterminated. But the biggest trust problem and the greatest trust evil is the growing and dangerous monopoly of all money and bank credit by a few Wall Street men, and the Aldrich Bill would increase this evil and danger 1,000-fold. Death always has been the chief means for redistributing wealth and preventing dangerous accumulations in the hands of individuals and families. The highest public policy demands the dissolution and scattering of excessive fortunes. The English plan of the oldest son inheriting all is made unlawful here. It was thus hoped to prevent swollen fortunes. But by will and trustee methods, this policy is being defeated. And unless great care is exercised, the perpetual corporation will be used as the means for perpetuating these giant fortunes, a victory over death and the laws of nature, and they will go on growing in size and power until they rule the government or destroy it altogether. Incorporated wealth is the greatest danger of this age. The railroads annually gather vast sums, much of which goes through Wall Street, because that is the location of the principal financial office of each system. They now have 239,991 miles of track, 1,699,420 employees, with 8 million dependents, aggregate capital stock, $8,380,819,190, and bonds $9,600,632,906. Total $17,981,454,096, and collect as gross earnings each year the enormous sum of $2,804,580,939. If all of this was sent to New York, and in cash the railroads annually would gather up and ship to Wall Street every dollar of money in the United States outside of the Treasury, including all actual money in the 24,302 banks of the country. Many railroads have vast accumulations of cash assets, deposited in favored banks, controlled by big financial interests that dominate the roads. Some lines have $30 million to $60 million of cash or liquid assets. Each million so deposited in New York banks, where the legal cash reserve is 25%, enables the bank to increase its credit loans $4 million. If the million is deposited in a country bank, where the reserve is 15%, or in a state or trust company, and 3/5 of it then is redeposited by the outside bank in a Wall Street bank, all of which can be done in one day, that $1 million forms the legal cash basis for about $10 million of extra credit loans by their cooperating banks. The stock exchange is the chief instrument used by high finance for despoiling wholesale the people of the entire country. It hides the character of the transactions and the identity of the parties. It bids up the interest on call loans and thus sucks out of the banks of the country and into Wall Street untold millions seeking usury. It causes the public each year a direct loss of more than $1 billion by methods that might fill the prisons with high financiers but for the fact that New York, for a liberal share of the ill-gotten gains, shields the guilty and licenses or tolerates these crimes against her sister states and the nation. Serious are the above-described conditions by practices of the Allied banks may constitute a bigger evil and their combined power a greater danger. This because of their countrywide organization, perfect machinery, political influence and activity, control of a large portion of the ready cash, and monopoly of the vastly larger volumes of bank credit. All business, individual, and corporate, more or less, is dependent always, or at certain periods, upon banks. It cannot prosper without bank assistance, because gradually business has worked away from the cash basis, and now 95% of the entire volume is carried on with bank credit. All American business is in the hollow of the bank hand, and can be aided or squeezed according to the will of the big interests that in recent years have acquired control over the banking system. Unless before too late businessmen help to check the growth of this dangerous incorporate bank power, their business eventually will be swallowed up in the great money maelstrom, or become food at some future feast of the all-devouring interest. And thousands who now proudly consider themselves independent bankers soon will be reduced in authority to mere clerks, hired servants, executing the orders and doing under compulsion the will of the absent Wall Street masters of finance, to the lasting injury of local business, their communities, neighbors, and friends. Will the banks prefer Wall Street for master to a law-regulated public institution? It must be one or the other. The United States Monetary Council would establish justice and the square deal as the rules of action in banking, finance, and business. Each bank, then, would keep its reserve balance with the council against which it can make and sell drafts for general business and use instead of New York drafts. This will break New York's monopoly and put every other city on equality with the metropolis. And there is nothing more important to the rest of the country than to stop the present rapid concentration in New York of power over every kind of enterprise and activity. As Rome was the Roman Empire, so New York will be the United States unless the balance of the country asserts its right to equal opportunity and speedily enforces the same with legal safeguards. A United States Monetary Council is the best instrument now available for that purpose. New York banks have little reason for keeping a deposit in any outside bank, but the present law respecting cash reserves induces country banks to keep large balances in New York banks. Instead of keeping its cash reserve at 15% of deposit liabilities, all in its own vault, the country bank is allowed to keep 3/5 thereof on deposit in some central reserve bank. New York pays 2% interest for such deposits. This tends to concentrate in New York a dangerous proportion of the country's cash capital. The Aldrich Plan leaves this reserve scheme unchanged, and most of the country's cash in Wall Street. National banks alone, on September 1, 1911, had $744,614,305 on deposit with reserve agent banks, half of the total cash held in all banks. $399,508,977 with national banks not reserve agents, and $162,271,793 with state banks and bankers, total $1,306,395,075. The actual cash in all the 7,331 national banks on that date was $941,362,369. Their credit loans were $5,663,411,073 and total resources $9,956,476,830. The 24,392 reporting banks of all kinds on June 7, 1911 combined had $1,508,000 $554,147,169 cash, $2,788,772,572 deposited by banks and other banks, $13,040,389,844 loans, and $23,631,083,382 of resources. These interdeposits between banks often is a bond binding them together for mutual advantage and profit. In this way, one bank may obtain a strong control over another. With all reserves in the United States Council, each bank will be independent. It no longer will depend for safety or profit on other banks or Wall Street. The cash or liquid assets deposited in the banks by the railroads, express, telegraph, telephone, industrial, and insurance companies that are controlled by a few men are believed to be equal to the $1,554,147,169 that comprises the total cash held by all the 24,392 banks. If so, then those men have power by withdrawing such deposits to force every bank to call in and cancel practically all of its loans, to force businessmen suddenly to pay up over $15 billion of debts to banks. That action, if taken, would plunge into bankruptcy most of the 24,392 banks and the borrowers of such banks, and inaugurate the greatest panic in history. Probably it will not be done, at least to that extent, but the power to do it is in the hands of a few Wall Street men, and every banker knows it, and is afraid to antagonize the high financiers. That is the black-hand threat that Wall Street ever holds over the financial institutions of the United States. That is the deadly power that would be abolished by the creation of the United States Monetary Council to regulate and protect the banks and the business of the country with an independent and ample supply of elastic public currency. The bank tax on all business computed at 5% on $23 billion of bank resources exceeds $1 billion per year, or more than the national debt. The transportation tax annually levied on business and commodities by railroads for service is nearly $3 billion. The insurance companies collect another $1 billion. The trusts probably as much as the railroads. These four agencies therefore collect from the people each year a total sum larger than the value of all crops. A larger portion of this vast business is expense that is added to the cost of food, clothing, and other things, and thus directly increases enormously the cost of living. This is in addition to the profit and expense added by many middlemen between producer and consumer. It does not include rent, gas, fuel, and numberless other items that enter into the cost of living. A large portion of these vast and ceaseless streams of money flows through many artificial channels extending all over the country, and now converge in Wall Street, financially draining the country and carrying to that one center an ever-increasing proportion of the people's income and nation's wealth. It was to simplify this process and make the desired results more certain that Wall Street invented the pending Aldrich Plan for a vast private central bank, or association that should legally and firmly and permanently bind the 24,392 banks, all in one vast combine for mutual profit and advantage as against the people. Is there a money trust? A trust is an artificial condition in any line of business that restrains trade and tends to eliminate competition and establish monopoly. Complete stoppage or control of trade is not necessary. Elimination of all competition or absolute monopoly is not essential. If the artificial conditions are such as to suppress competition entirely or in part and create complete or partial monopoly, it is a trust. The conditions not only must naturally operate to produce these results, but they must be artificial. If the conditions are artificial created and naturally tend to produce such results, the law will assume that those creating such conditions intend thus to form a trust. Incorporation is not essential in forming a trust. The growing, selfish, and insolent money power, incorporated and unincorporated, violates every law regulating and restraining its conduct, treats the people and their government with contempt, and then invokes the protection of the laws and the courts to shield the stolen vested rights and privileges against violence that their own lawless course tends to incite. Wall Street is a trust. It is a trust manufacturing trust. Every condition there is artificial and calculated to eliminate competition and install monopoly. And it actively seeks to establish this trust condition among railroads, industries, and banks. The chief object is increased profits. There are many money trusts. In every city, the banks are forming a local trust, usually by clearinghouse rules or oral agreements. The object is to keep as low as possible the interest paid for deposits and as high as possible the interest charged borrowers. If bank power continues to grow in time, they will pay no interest on deposits. In form and effect, it is an injurious conspiracy against depositors and borrowers, the customers of banks. The agreements are identical, and for the same object in the banking business as in the acts of the industrial world that are made criminal by the antitrust law. And there is less reason or excuse for these bank trusts that control the supply of money and credit than for industrial trusts, and they are far more burdensome and dangerous. The prices of exchange and other bank charges often are regulated locally by trust agreement. The policy of charging regular customers exchange on out-of-town checks deposited is spreading rapidly by clearinghouse agreements. A certain city that has about 500,000 population recently adopted the scheme. Next day, a leading hotel was charged by its bank 15 cents exchange on a $50 check drawn by writer on a Cincinnati bank. If the same rate was charged on a whole $160 billion of checks that yearly go through clearinghouses, the tax on business and extra net profits of the banks would be increased $480 million, or enough to pay an extra annual dividend of 24% on the entire capital stock of the 24,392 banks. Banks are now making excessive profits, but as their wealth and power increases, they will extort more and more from business, if business will permit it. All such trust agreements among banks either should be prohibited or made general and uniform by law with severe punishment for discriminations. There should either be real and unrestricted competition for loans and business among banks, or a uniform scale of charges should be fixed and enforced by law. There should be no money trust at all among banks or a trust strictly regulated by law. That is the only safety, the one protection for business. Were it not for these local money trusts, the general bank discount rate would be 4% or 5% instead of 6%, with a reasonable allowance as interest on deposit accounts. And ordinary depositors of cash would get 4% or 5% for the money that enables the bank to loan 4 to 10 times as much credit as 6%. And if bank favoritism and discrimination was stopped, and trusts and stock gamblers were not allowed to borrow at 2% while others must pay 6%, and all were treated impartially, the banks could establish a uniform 4% discount rate and make just as much profit. And a 4% rate, or even 5%, would wonderfully stimulate legitimate business and promote national prosperity, and greatly reduce the cost of necessities in living. Then there is a general money trust. It is not incorporated, not yet, but it is real. An artificial condition exists in the world of big finance that tends to eliminate genuine competition for loans, deposits, issues of bonds, and deals requiring financing. Insiders cooperate instead of compete, and they have more profits to divide, and outsiders pay more and get less because this money trust condition, through fear and favor, has merged control of money and bank credit largely in the hands of a few men. These men, by direct or indirect means, dominate practically all the important financial institutions of the United States. The will of these men is a most complete, definite, powerful, and dangerous money trust. Its intangible and invisible form increases its irresponsibility, rapacity, craft, and daring. A hidden power is the most dangerous and most difficult to locate, regulate, or restrain. While a powerful and supreme money trust exists and dominates in the larger sense all American finance and business, and everybody knows of this fact, it will be difficult, if not impossible, to reach and properly control it by direct regulating statutes. But its power for evil can be greatly diminished by indirect agencies. Laws with suitable penalties stopping all bank discriminations, usurious interest rates, margin gambling, regulating the stock exchanges, divorcing the trusts, banks, railroads, and insurance companies from each other, and regulating the use of their cash funds, taking the bank reserves out of Wall Street, and mobilizing them in one central reservoir under government regulation, and creation of the United States Monetary Council as a greater financial power than Wall Street, made independent and impartial by law, able and ever ready to aid and protect the 24,392 banks of the country, and the business customers of such banks with an ample supply of sound elastic currency and credit, will stop most of the glaring evils and abuses and bring Wall Street and its lawless element ultimately under the effective control of the federal government. And there is no other way to get adequate relief from present intolerable conditions. The pending Aldrich Plan is a long step in the opposite direction. Instead of curtailing it, it would multiply the already overswollen power of those few Wall Street men. Their money trust, then, would be complete, incorporated, a legal body entitled to claim the protection of the laws and the courts. Acts now evil, if not criminal, would be made lawful, and the National Reserve Association, as a vast private money trust, would become the ruling power in finance and business. Shall the present outlaw money trust, that now must hide in the shadows and operate in the darkness, the bandit of the financial highway, be called and crowned by act of Congress as the supreme sovereign of finance and business, a lawful money trust, the incorporated master of 24,392 banks, and of all industries, commerce, and politics? The National Reserve Association will have power of life and death over the business of every man, the affairs of every corporation, the welfare of every community, and the prosperity of the nation. It will be judge, jury, and executioner. By inflating and contracting its corporate currency and raising and lowering its discount rate, it can raise and lower at will the prices of all securities, property, and human labor. By cooperating with the private central banks abroad, it will help establish a universal money trust that will eliminate all competition between banks and bankers for bonds and loans, and this worldwide money monopoly will double the mortgage on all mankind by increasing interest rates everywhere. To it, Congress is asked to hand over, as a free gift, $1 billion of public currency, money, the property and medium of exchange of 94 million people, to be forever retained and loaned out to the people for its profit. It may have power to run the nation into debt or liability for billions of dollars as guarantor of the emissions of its printing press, on corporate currency issued without limit or effective restraint. By act of Congress, the public revenues of the Republic for a half-century are to be mortgaged to this money trust. 40 billions, collected by taxation to be turned over for deposit and use by this private corporation without 1 cent of compensation. By resolution adopted by vote of the 5 men who compose the majority of its executive committee, it can, in secret and without notice, contract and cancel 1 million, 100 million, or 500 million of its corporate currency, and at one breath thus annihilate billions of bank credit built as a tenfold inverted pyramid on such currency, forcing every bank to call in its loans, and every business borrower to pay its bank obligations at whatever sacrifice. It will have power to abolish prosperity and inflict panic, plunging the entire nation into the horrors of a financial catastrophe that would paralyze industry and commerce, close the factories, and turn millions of workmen out to tramp the streets without means to provide food and shelter for their helpless wives and children. To 5 men, perhaps mere dummies, irresponsible, paid employees of an unregulated, uncontrolled, and unrestrained private corporation, Congress is asked to absolutely and unreservedly commit for 50 years the vital destinies of the Republic in the interests and welfare of its 94 million inhabitants. The National Reserve Association, a great private central bank, owned by the banks controlled by Wall Street, is to be invested with supreme governmental powers and incorporated as a great dominating money trust by law, independent of government and above all public authority. That is the omnipotent and deadly Octopus Congress is urged to legally set loose and install as the master of American banks, business, finance, industry, commerce, and politics. Its poisonous and itching tentacles will gradually reach out and bind themselves about every home, farm, industry, bank, the public treasury, courts, Congress, and the White House, gathering to itself supreme political power, sucking the wealth and substance of the people into Wall Street, and dumping it into the stock exchange, or the eager lapse of the handful of men who will seek by moral, if not by legal treason, to rob the people of their God-given liberty, destroy the Republic as a living reality, and in its place erect an empire, disguised as a democracy, with incorporated wealth crowned as the ruling sovereign, and all the people its subjects. This is the coming incorporated money monster. End of chapter 22.
Section number 26 of U.S. Money vs. Corporation Currency, Aldrich Plan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elsie Selwyn. U.S. Money versus Corporation Currency Aldrich Plan by Alfred Owen CROZIER. Appendix, Correspondence Part 1. Appendix. A central bank trust. President of the United States gets analysis of the Aldrich Plan made by author, position of President Taft. Letters and inside facts made public. On November 16, 1911, the author of this volume met President William H. Taft in the White House at Washington to discuss certain proposed changes in the monetary and banking laws, and particularly the so-called Aldrich Plan for a private central bank urged by the National Monetary Commission. A written statement or analysis of that plan then was given to the President, its receipt being formally acknowledged by his secretary in the following letter. The White House, Washington, November 17, 1911. My dear Sir, I have brought to the President's attention your letter of the 10th instant, which you left with me yesterday. Sincerely yours, Secretary to the President. Mr. Alfred O. CROZIER, Grand Rapids, Michigan. In the interest of a more general understanding among the people of the important questions involved in the suggested revolutionary changes in our currency and banking systems, and in view of recent events, it seems advisable and proper here to make such statement public. It is as follows. Grand Rapids, Michigan, November 10, 1911. Honorable William H. Taft, President of the United States, Washington, D.C. Dear Sir, your secretary, Mr. Hiles, at Milwaukee, suggested that I see you in Washington to personally discuss with you the proposed changes in the monetary and banking systems, and that I write out and send to you my views on the subject. Therefore, without assuming any want of knowledge about these matters on your part, as a citizen and Republican, I respectfully venture these few observations. You, of course, know that the gold standard is firmly and permanently established and is not an issue in the present monetary campaign. This simplifies the situation. Shall control of the public currency be public or private? That is the real question, and about the only one in serious dispute. On this vital issue in the immediate future, the greatest monetary struggle in the nation's history is likely to take place. It may largely overshadow all other political problems, and the successful party of the future, I believe, will be the one that takes the people's side in this contest. Former Correspondence. You may recall my letter of August 20th, 1909, to you at Beverly, just before former Senator Aldrich called upon you there. I then told you that I had information that the National Monetary Commission would report in favor of a central bank to issue, inflate, and contract the public currency, the institution to be a private corporation owned by the banks, which meant ultimate control by Wall Street. About 10 days later, in a public address at Boston, a few days after your conference with President Aldrich of the Commission, you said that the trend of the minds of a majority of the Monetary Commission was in favor of a central bank of issue, but that if such institution is created, it must not be controlled by Wall Street or by politics. This public warning was timely, to the point, and named the greatest dangers to be avoided. It is my view that any private corporation controlling the currency supply of the entire country inevitably would in time be controlled by Wall Street, and that it will use the imperial powers of the institution over all banks, and through the banks over the business of every man and corporation to dominate in its own interest the politics of the states and nation. That if such an institution be needed and is created, it should be a public institution under absolute public control instead of a private corporation. I am opposed to Congress taking from the government $1 billion of public currency used by the people as their chief money supply and handing it over as a free gift into an irresponsible private syndicate to be forever retained and loaned out for the exclusive profit of such syndicate. The Aldrich Plan. The revised Aldrich Plan put forward by the National Monetary Commission asks Congress to create a great central bank to be named National Reserve Association. It is to be a private corporation. The $300 million stock is all to be owned by the banks in proportion to the size of their capital stock. For example, the National City Bank of New York, having $25 million of capital, will own 1,000 times as much National Reserve Association stock as a country bank with $25,000 of capital. 3 large Wall Street banks together will own nearly as much central bank stock as half of all the national banks of the United States, taking the smaller banks. If all the stock is subscribed and only half payment is required, the 4% stock will net the banks 8%. The big banks, of course, will own the central bank, and Wall Street will control the big banks. Already the larger banks are organizing side partner security companies, a sort of financial Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, to acquire banks throughout the country to control the central bank. The National City Company is the Siamese twin of the largest Wall Street bank. It is reported to have already acquired more than 100 large banks in Washington, Chicago, and elsewhere. But it was too hasty or too public about it. Publicity of this illegal scheme endangers the Aldrich Plan in Congress. So we are told that at least for a time the National City Company is to put all these bank stocks out of its hands. Presumably the certificates will go into friendly hands or remain under its control. Then ostrich-like, it will be completely hidden from the people because its head is buried in the sand. The elaborate and complicated system of branch boards and local associations does not fully disguise or change the potent fact that the National Reserve Association will be a private corporation owned and absolutely controlled by the special interests. The banking fraternity is to select 42 of the 46 directors of the National Reserve Association. The other 4 are public officials representing the interests of 90 million people whose entire public currency supply is to be handed over by Congress to be forever kept and manipulated by this private corporation. As 4 is not a majority of 46, this share of control allotted to the public would be a huge joke, if not so dangerous. The ratio of 42 to 4 in favor of the banks doubtless correctly represents the division of benefits between the special interests and the people. The general plan, in most features, is all right, but the scheme of private instead of public control reveals the climax of the greed and audacity of high finance. It is conceded that the scheme originated in Wall Street, and I think you will take judicial notice that high finance never supports a financial measure unless its interests and power will be advanced by its adoption. Private monopoly of the public currency. The chief aim of the interests is to obtain through a corporation owned by them a private monopoly of the public currency. In my letter of August 20th, 1909, I fully explained how at the New York meeting of the National Civic Federation, December 17th, 1907, the distinguished Wall Street bankers present publicly refused to accept my amendment to their currency reform resolution, viz., provided that control of the volume of the public currency shall not be taken away from the federal government and put into private hands. In that letter, also, I recalled the fact that in his emergency currency bill, Senator Aldrich attempted to eliminate from the present law the prohibition against contracting the national bank currency more than $9 million per month, and that he consented to strike out of his bill this dangerous provision, allowing unlimited and sudden contraction of the entire public currency only when attention was called to the matter by the public reading of my petition in the Senate the next day after his speech for his bill. Thus every currency move emanating from Wall Street seems to be an effort to induce Congress to give private interests unlimited power suddenly to contract the currency supply, to make money scarce without warning. The private syndicate under the Aldrich Plan, without any substantial consideration to the government, is to get nearly $1 billion of currency used as money for about the cost of printing. This money never will be returned to the government. Millions will be destroyed or burned by accident. The benefit goes to the syndicate, not, as now, to the people. This syndicate of bankers, for its own profits, is to loan this vast public currency to their own banks. If the banks are to use it as a reserve basis, it will enable them to loan to the people for interest profits more than $10 billion of bank credit in the shape of ordinary bank loans. For thus empowering the syndicate and its banks with relatively little extra investment to collect from the people continuously interest on about $10 billion of extra loans, the Aldrich Plan demands that the syndicate pay the government 1.5% per annum on all currency issued in excess of $900 million and 5% on all excess of $1,200,000,000, but nothing on the first $900 million. Even this apparent generosity vanishes in the light of the fact that it is not expected this currency ever will exceed $900 million. Many believe that this currency will not pass at par unless backed by the faith and credit of the government, and that this should be pledged. If the government is to be responsible for the currency and a private syndicate is to issue and own it and get the profits from its use, would not the government in effect be in a position similar to a man loaning his promissory note for $1 billion to another party who gets the note cashed and forever keeps and uses the entire proceeds? Dangerous currency contraction. Banks, as you know, loan credit, not money. This is the right to draw checks to the total of the note discounted. Borrower gets a bank book showing his credit. This makes him a depositor, although he has put in no actual money. By thus increasing its loans of credit, a bank correspondingly can increase its deposits without getting an extra dollar, almost indefinitely. About the only legal limitation is that it must have in cash in its vault an amount equal to a certain percent of its deposit liabilities, varying from 25% down to 7.5%, according to the location of the bank. The official reports show that the banks as a whole loan 8 to 12 times as much credit as they have in cash. I have not at hand more recent reports, but the report of the U.S. Comptroller of the currency for 1907 shows that the collective individual deposits, not including deposits by banks, of all the 19,746 reporting national and state banks and trust companies amounted to $13,099,600,000, while their aggregate cash reserves amounted to $1,113,742,316, or 8.5% of their aggregate deposit liabilities due to individuals. When the banks are fully loaned up, if by withdrawals or otherwise their cash reserves are decreased half, under the law they must decrease their total loans 1/2. They must force their customers suddenly to pay up loans aggregating 8 to 12 times the shrinkage of cash reserves. If $500 million thus is withdrawn from bank reserves, business borrowers must pay up at once over $5 billion of loans due to the banks, an amount more than twice the total of all the money in circulation in the United States, no matter what sacrifices of securities, properties, and commodities it entails. The banks cannot do other than force such payments, even if it closes industries, plunges labor into idleness, causes general distress, panic, and financial ruin. A private corporation with power suddenly to contract the outstanding public currency without limit, of course thereby could almost to any extent deplete the reserves of the banks and force them immediately to call in their loans in such volumes that general panic and financial disaster would be inevitable. Likewise, by inflating the currency, it could increase bank reserves and enormously and even dangerously expand the loaning power and profits of the banks. In order that this vital and all-controlling power over the banks and all business, the power to inflate and contract the public currency, might not be feared by the people as formidable, not to say dangerous, it has been given an enticing name, elasticity. No doubt elasticity of the currency and of the loaning power of the banks is desirable, but it may make a great difference to the people and their interests who does the stretching, and for what purpose it is done. Is it wise or patriotic for Congress unnecessarily to grant an obviously dangerous power to uncontrolled powerful private interests, leaving the people for protection only the mere hope that such interests will not use the power against the general welfare and for their own private profit? Artificial panics. It is the belief of many that some panics or quasi-panics have been more or less deliberately caused for improper purposes, and that most panics are due chiefly to artificial and removable causes. Every panic in history seems to have started in Wall Street. To stop panics, should we not go there and remedy the evils that tend to create panics, such as margin gambling, usurious interest rates, and illegal bank practices, instead of merely legislating to safeguard the banks against the results of panics. You may know of the fact that 75% of all transactions on the stock exchange are fictitious, illegal, gambling, and wash sales, and that 80% of the money and credit to conduct such deals is supplied by the banks that hold the deposit savings of the people. Congress will have to act to protect the country against these harmful things, because the great state of New York, for about $4 million annually in stock transfer fees, has sold to the gamblers the privilege of wrongfully despoiling on its soil the people of that state and of the United States. Long before the Panic of 1907, in writing and orally, I expressed the belief that a panic might be caused to pinch the country into crying for monetary reform and to accelerate in Congress the prearranged program of Wall Street. The panic in the Object Lesson came just before the Congress convened, in which was first introduced the legislative measures prepared and publicly advocated by Wall Street bankers and the New York Chamber of Commerce months before the panic, including in substance the identical privately owned central bank scheme now known as the revised Aldrich Plan, the National Reserve Association. At said National Civic Federation meeting in December 1907, when a majority present were Wall Street businessmen or their friends, I publicly expressed my belief that the Panic of 1907 was artificial. No one present disputed the charge. The facts about serious Wall Street moves seldom become public, but it was reported that at the recent congressional investigation of the Steel Trust, one of the most prominent financial men of Wall Street, Oakley Thorne, president of the Trust Company of America, on oath astonished the country by declaring in substance or effect that the Panic of 1907 was artificial, was deliberately caused, and named the Wall Street interests he is said to have sworn started the run on the banks that precipitated the financial crisis. And now the government in its suit against the Steel Trust gravely charges some of the same people with illegal acts or criminal conspiracy and with using the financial institutions and capital of the country for unlawful purposes. And these are the same interests that largely will control the National Reserve Association and its autocratic and dangerous powers, thereby creating a financial monopoly, a trust of the trusts, under express authority of the Congress, at the very time when the government and the courts are trying to destroy monopoly by breaking up the trusts. A monopoly of banking and currency will give them ultimately a complete monopoly over about everything worth controlling in the United States, including government itself. At a recent meeting of the New York Bankers Association, in a public address, one of the most prominent Wall Street bankers virtually threatened the country with another panic unless Congress yielded to the demand of Wall Street and adopted the Aldrich Central Bank Scheme. After the Aldrich-Vreeland Emergency Currency Bill had passed the Senate in 1908, I was present at a public hearing before the House Banking and Currency Committee. More than a dozen bankers, members of the Currency Commission of the National Bankers Association, were present and spoke against the measure, as did many representatives of the larger commercial organizations of the country. Replying to direct questions by members of the committee, every banker solemnly declared that if the bill passed it would cause another panic, and several said the panic would arrive in less than 3 months. The bill passed, but no panic has occurred, and more than 3 years has elapsed. Either those distinguished bankers were poor prophets, or the change made in the bill striking out the Senate amendments that prohibited persons being both directors of a bank and of a corporation borrowing from that bank, and lowering the government tax on the emergency currency so as to make it profitable for the banks to handle it, warded off the predicted panic and saved the country. To cause a panic, or even to threaten the country with one to frighten or force the people in Congress into passing laws that otherwise would be defeated, is a species of duress utterly indefensible and dangerous. It is worse than the rule of the mob, for the public prediction of panic tends to cause panic, and the financial and fatal consequences of panic often are pathetic. It is not my desire to stir up class feeling or arraign bankers as a whole. Most bankers are honest, patriotic, and useful citizens. But the above incident was a public proceeding, and the printed records show the facts as stated. This would seem to be a good time and opportunity to resist the unjust and selfish legislative demands of the interests and thus for all time settled the question as to which is supreme and the most powerful, Wall Street or the government and the people of the United States. Control currency to manipulate prices. The Aldrich Plan grants to such private corporation direct control over interest rates by the unregulated, unrestricted, and unlimited power to increase and decrease the discount rate. If it should increase the discount rate to the banks, of course the banks would do the same or more to their customers. Otherwise, those in control of the central bank by increasing the discount rate could instantly deprive every bank and trust company in the United States of a substantial portion of their entire profits. Would not every banking institution in the country in sheer self-defense find itself obliged to obey the financial and political orders of those who may have seized control of the National Reserve Association? Would not this create a vast and dangerous political machine that inevitably would result either in its controlling the federal government or itself being abolished for political action like the old United States Bank of Andrew Jackson's time in the midst of universal panic and financial chaos? The central bank, simply by inflating and contracting the public currency or by raising or lowering the discount rates, could automatically and immediately raise and lower the prices of all securities, property, and labor. Prices of the $25 billion of listed securities at times fluctuate at least 20 to 50%. This is partly due to natural causes, but more often it is due to unfair manipulation by secret pools that cause interest rates to be run up on the stock exchange to ruinous figures and bank loans to be called in large volumes to aid inside operators in their speculations against the public. And yet a drop of but 10% in the average price quotations indicates a direct and immediate loss to the holders of securities of a sum equal to all the money in circulation in the United States. Bidding up the rate on call loans is the effective magnet used to entice away from local business the money of the people deposited in banks that it may be used in high finance flotations and to promote gambling speculation in Wall Street. Bank discriminations. A related evil that should be made impossible by law while Congress is reforming the banking system is the practice of many large banks of discriminating in the matter of loans and interest rates in favor of trusts, insiders, and stock speculators. Why should trust and Wall Street operators usually be able to borrow from the banks practically in unlimited quantities at 2%, while responsible business and commercial customers often cannot borrow enough properly to conduct legitimate business and always must pay 200 to 300% more as interest than is paid by stock gamblers? As the banking system is a quasi-public institution clothed with a public interest by law, enjoying special privileges and immunities, it should exercise its duties to the public impartially, without discrimination, and not in any way be an instrument used to oppress individuals, corporations, or communities, or to promote unlawful monopolies and unnatural and improper concentration of wealth in the few to the disadvantage of the many. International money monopoly. You of course realize that whoever controls the monetary circulation to a large extent will control the credit, interest rates, price, and the business activities of the world. A central bank issuing the public currency, if a private corporation naturally will cooperate with the great privately owned government banks abroad and comprise in effect an international monetary trust with a worldwide monopoly of money. The result, if not the design, will be permanently to eliminate all competition for large loans. This will make it easy to double the mortgage on mankind without $1 of extra benefit, simply by increasing the rate of interest on nearly 30 billions of bonds of governments and the vast quantities of state, municipal, and corporation bonds, as they mature and from time to time are refunded. The revised Aldrich Plan proposes immediately to increase the rate of interest and so refund the national debt of the United States, amounting to nearly $1 billion that it will not be paid off for half a century. It would unnecessarily mortgage the next generation before it is born. Surely this is not the desire of the people, and I do not believe their Congress will do it. In a broad sense, there is always a struggle on by the great individual and corporate owners of the vast fixed income or bond wealth of the world to decrease the relative value of property and labor. as measured in money by increasing the rate of interest on bonds. Thus they hoped to recover what they lost when Providence unexpectedly swelled the output of gold until gold and gold bonds now will purchase much less labor or property. By bringing the large competitors for such bonds into cooperation, either interest rates can be increased or the bonds be bought below par, because there will be no other available market for the bonds. The Aldrich Plan will help create an international financial world power above and beyond the reach of all law, that through the power of the purse will be able to rule governments and kingdoms, cause peace and war, extort from the peoples of the world an ever-increasing interest toll, and tend to develop a civilization where the dollar with its metallic heart will be of more importance than man with his immortal soul. And the more war there is, the greater the demand for money for armies and battleships, and the higher the interest rates can be raised by the coming great international monetary combine. An alternative plan. At the New York meeting of the Academy of Political Science in December 1910, President Aldrich and other members of the Monetary Commission being present, I suggested tentatively an alternative plan. We had listened to the clever and astute arguments for the Aldrich Plan by the distinguished Wall Street bankers present. One of them is a partner in a great international banking house said to represent in America the Rothschilds of Europe. He declared gravely that if dividends on the central bank stock are limited by law to 4%, there would be no danger of control of the institution falling into the hands of the special interests, because there would not be enough temptation to make them want control. Replying, I cited the purchase of a few thousands of equitable life insurance stock for $2,500,000 made by a well-known Wall Street banker when the law limits dividends on the stock to 7% annually, and said that it was power the banker sought, and that it was the power the interests seek through a central bank under their control. I then told them that I did not believe they ever could persuade Congress to take away from the government and grant to a private corporation an exclusive monopoly of the entire public currency. The great issue now raised is whether control of the public currency shall be public or private. It always has been public, and the Constitution so intended. The burden of proof is so on those urging the radical change. Suppose we grant the need of currency and banking reforms, consolidation of bank reserves, elasticity, a central bank or agency to issue the currency, and even rediscount for the banks. In fact, to do all of the things proposed by the Aldrich Plan. And as recent concentration of banking capital and power in the hands of the same few who dominate the trusts, railroads, and other large activities seem to have made it now impossible to finance or conduct any important undertaking without their consent, perhaps it is necessary to create a central institution with financial power greater than Wall Street to emancipate the banks and the business of the country from this tightening and dangerous grip. But no convincing reason has been advanced why the National Reserve Association should be a private corporation instead of a public institution under public control. Why should Congress make the dangerous experiment when the historical public control will be better and more safe? Ample safeguards easily can be provided that will keep all partisanship and politics out of the institution. There are several ways to provide public control. One way, the plan I suggested at said Academy meeting, is to have the President appoint a board, say of 100 non-salaried governors, one on the nomination of the governor of each state. This body to select an executive committee of well-paid, highly trained financial experts, sworn as public servants and divorced from all other business, to run the institution. This plan, or some modification of it, would ensure representation and fair treatment to every state, guard against partisanship, and inspire the confidence of the people, which is necessary to ensure the usefulness and permanency of any such institution. It will be far safer for banks to be able to obtain adequate assistance direct from a public institution as a defined legal right instead of begging a favor from a private corporation, and perhaps on the side being forced to submit to some unprofitable secret agreement with the interest and control of the corporation by way of flotations or the purchase of securities. The banks constantly will be in grave peril if the Aldrich Plan is adopted. They will be the storm center of such bitter partisan strife, crimination and suspicion that depositors may take alarm, withdraw, and hoard money, inflicting upon the banks and the country in even more aggravated form the very evils and dangers sought to be avoided by monetary reform. Public investigations of banks and bank practices will be frequent, demanded, and conducted for partisan purposes. If my definite information is correct, and I believe it is, that the official reports on file with the United States Comptroller of the Currency show, on sworn admissions, that nearly 40% of all national banks knowingly violate the law, you can see the harm to the banks and the handle that would be made politically if these reports were made public and exploited in a partisan congressional investigation of the banking system. The exigencies of political strife might emblazon the fact that right now there are more than 60 convicts who formerly were bankers in just one of the many prisons, and wholly unwarranted inferences might be drawn, casting unjustifiable suspicion upon all bankers, when, as we know, the great majority are law-abiding, upright, and useful citizens. This may excite public fear, induce runs on banks, do permanent harm to the influence of bankers generally, and endanger the solvency of their institutions. The Aldrich Plan, if adopted, I believe will stir up class distinction and hatred more than any legislation ever proposed in the country's history. What folly to take these risks when it is not necessary. If the banks reach for more profit and power, they may have many of the special privileges and immunities they now enjoy taken away. At best, the interest and power of any country bank in the central bank will be insignificant and useless. Bankers should remember that in Andrew Jackson's time, when banks became the issue in politics, they suffered frightfully along with the entire country and the resulting panic. As the nation and its activities now are more extensive, the calamity may be far greater. An attempt is being made to persuade or drive all bankers into a suicidal support of the Aldrich scheme. But I know that there are very many patriotic bankers who realize the danger and will vigorously oppose the plan. Some will not, because afraid of reprisals by Wall Street. I do not believe Congress will farm out the public currency to be forever exploited for the profit of a private syndicate. If Congress insists that control of the National Reserve Association be public instead of private, and those promoting it oppose and block all monetary reform because their personal interests are not served, the responsibility for any resulting future panics will be upon them. You will understand that we do not oppose the legitimate business of Wall Street, but insist that its lawless and unjust acts must cease. The practice of the interests, and hailing as a statesman the man who furthers their designs, and crying demagogue when anyone objects to their unfair use of the powers and laws of government against the general welfare, has lost its effect because the people are more thoughtful, observant, and alert in their own interest. You, of course, realize that no monetary or banking reform is possible as a permanent solution of current defects unless it accords with the discriminating judgment of a majority of the voters of the United States. Your commanding position, power to recommend to Congress and to veto its acts, makes it possible for you to protect the country by defeating this attempt to obtain private control of the public currency. For this reason, my appeal is addressed to you with full confidence, and in this I know I voice the earnest views of very many citizens. Mr. President, still I am an optimist. Most people are good, but in the Steel Trust suit the government seems to think some are not so good. It is no want of faith in humanity when we object to Congress taking an obviously dangerous power from the government and the entire people and unreservedly putting it into the irresponsible hands of the selfish few. Very respectfully yours, signed Alfred O. CROZIER. President Taft's position. Writer is a Republican, but Lincoln, not Aldrich, is his ideal. He has admired the judicial temperament and genial personality of President Taft, and approved many of his important official acts during his long public career. He had hoped the President would take such a stand for the people and against the special interests that his reflection would be advisable, imperative. Believing that the crucial test of the President's courage and independence would come when the Monetary Commission reported to Congress the predetermined plan for the creation of a huge money trust to privately control the public currency and rule the banks and through them the business of the entire country, Arthur in all fairness and in writing frequently made the President aware of the true situation, so that there would be no chance of his being taken by surprise or misled. The foregoing, one of many during the past 3 years, illustrates. Ryder's letter of August 20th, 1909 to the President was received and read just before Senator Aldrich arrived at Beverly to confer about the Monetary Commission's work and, if reports then current were correct, to urge a special session of Congress to hastily put through the central bank scheme in November 1909. If that course was contemplated, it was abandoned as unwise. About 3 weeks after his conference with Aldrich at Beverly, the first public intimation was given that the Monetary Commission was even considering a central bank plan. This was made by President Taft in his Boston speech on September 14, 1909, the first of his 13,000-mile western trip. In that speech he said, "It is apparent from the statements of Mr. Vreeland and Mr. Aldrich that the trend of minds of the Monetary Commission is towards some sort of arrangement for a central bank of issue, which shall control the reserve and exercise a power to meet and control the casual stringency which from time to time will come in the circulating medium of the country and the world." End of Appendix, Correspondence Part 1. Recording by Elsie Selwyn. Section 27 of U.S. Money vs. Corporation Currency, Aldrich Plan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elsie Selwyn. U.S. Money vs. Corporation Currency, Aldrich Plan by Alfred Owen CROZIER. Appendix, Correspondence Part 2. Mr. Aldrich states that there are 2 indispensable requirements in any plan to be adopted, involving a central bank of issue. The one is that the control of the money system shall be kept free from the Wall Street influences, and the other, that it shall not be manipulated for political purposes. These are 2 principles in which we can all subscribe. This public declaration was what Ryder hoped to call out from Mr. Aldrich or the President by the letter of August 20th, 1909, so the country might know what was coming. Nearly a year earlier, Ryder had caused one of the leading press correspondents of New York to personally interview Frank A. Vanderlip, then Vice President and now President of that great Standard Oil institution, the National City Bank. Mr. Vanderlip then was reported as saying, in 1908, that the Monetary Commission would report in favor of a central bank to issue and control the currency. Because that bank had led in the fight for a central bank and to create the Monetary Commission, and on account of Senator Aldrich being the father-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., this early information was considered reliable, as now it proves to have been. That letter was as follows. The White House, Washington, Beverly, Massachusetts, August 23, 1909. My dear sir, your letter of August 20th in regard to financial legislation has been received and will be brought to the attention of the President. Very truly yours, Secretary of the President. Mr. Alfred O. CROZIER, Wilmington, Delaware. Wilmington, Delaware, August 20th, 1909. Honorable William H. Taft, Beverly, Massachusetts. Dear Sir, I most earnestly hope that no special session of Congress will be called prior to December to attempt currency legislation. There would not be sufficient time for the people and press to study and discuss so important and difficult a subject. There may be those who urge a special session as a means of passing measures that could not be put through if the country was given time to learn the true character and effect of such a law, but I am sure you would not knowingly countenance such a course. You have in a short time won the confidence of the masses, and they trust your judgment and vigilance to guard their welfare and prevent hasty and ill-considered laws. It would seem that your responsibility in this regard is particularly heavy because the average man does not realize how his business and general welfare may be jeopardized by unwise banking and currency laws. I had hoped it might be convenient to discuss this subject with you personally before it came to an issue, but the published report of the talk of an extra session impels me to write you. Now, Mr. President, I think there is ample evidence to establish beyond reasonable doubt that there is on foot a determined movement, well concealed from the people, to take from the people's government and to put into private hands all control over the volume of the public currency. This, of course, would mean direct or indirect control by Wall Street of the people's entire money supply. Those exercising this power to inflate and contract at will the volume of the circulating medium could thereby easily, and to a large extent, increase and decrease the prices of securities, property, and labor. Are we ready to take a step so full of possible peril to the public welfare? Should it even be considered at a special session that it can at most last only a few weeks? The power to contract suddenly and arbitrarily the volume of currency available for business necessarily carries with it power to increase interest rates, to wreck credit, derange business, endanger the solvency of banks and the security of depositors, and even to cause panics. It is not sufficient to believe that such a power would not be used to that extent by human beings. Is it wise or patriotic to put such enormous power into private hands when it is not necessary? If it is attempted, I believe it will be the beginning of one of the greatest financial struggles in recent history, one vastly more intense and important than the silver controversy, one that will engender class hatred as never before, and I do not want to see the Republican Party committed to the wrong side. It seems to me it is relatively less important what our money is made of, so long it is redeemable in gold and backed by the credit of the federal government, than it is to have its volume free from private control and manipulation and ever responsive to the varying demands of business. To get currency elasticity, it should not be necessary to give individuals the power to contract when it should expand. Better, no elasticity unless we can have one that will operate automatically in response to the rise and fall of natural demand. I firmly believe if a fight for private control over the public currency is started, it will lead to an irresistible demand for a government issue of national currency exclusively, all redeemable in gold, the volume to be regulated from day to day by the federal government. I am not saying that this would be wise, but I think it would be inevitable, and preferable if the alternative is private Wall Street control, direct or indirect, over all the money of the people. The distinguished governor of one of our largest states said to me that he could not believe anyone would seriously propose such a plan, yet the Committee on Resolutions at the National Civic Federation meeting, a majority of whom were Wall Street men, flatly refused in public to accept my amendment to their currency resolution, which said merely, provided that the power to regulate the volume of the public currency shall not be taken from the federal government and put into private hands. The Aldrich currency bill, when reported, contained a provision allowing sudden contraction not only of the $500 million of emergency currency, but also the $700 million of banknote circulation, totaling $1,200 million, or nearly half of all currency in circulation in the United States. When my petition of protest was read in open Senate in the midst of the discussion of that bill, exposing this dangerous provision, Senator Aldrich instantly went privately to the senator who introduced my petition and told him the Finance Committee would strike out the provision allowing the sudden contracting of the entire banknote currency. But why was it put in at all? Those who drafted that bill, and those in whose interests many believe it was framed, are not novices. There are those who believe that the Aldrich-Vreeland law was largely but a foil for the real measure desired, and which will be revealed only when the Monetary Commission created by that law reports, and that the recent significant reorganization of certain congressional committees was part of a predetermined plan to force through Congress the mysterious measure, the character of which is to be carefully concealed from the public until the last moment. If this be true, the demand of the interested promoters for hasty action at a special session is explained. If information which came to me nearly a year ago proves correct, the Monetary Commission will report in favor of a great central bank. This is to be given absolute control of the financial business of the government, with exclusive power to issue currency ad libitum and to contract the volume at its pleasure. This institution to be called a government bank, but owned privately. It will be thinly sugar-coated by a provision allowing the president to appoint some of the directors. The chief fight then will be as to whether the institution shall be owned and controlled privately or by the government. The Republican Party cannot afford to take the wrong side if this issue is to be forced upon the country. It will court disaster if it does so. The people were led to expect that the Monetary Commission would be open and impartial in its investigation and hearings, giving ample opportunity to all who might desire to be heard. The hearings have mostly been held in Europe and not in the country chiefly concerned. They have been as secret as a council planning a military campaign. Those attended, who were privately invited, and their names have been carefully concealed from the public. The people and the press of the United States have been completely ignored, and now rumor says that you are to be asked to convene Congress in extraordinary session to receive and hastily act on this mysterious report, presumably that its plan may be enacted into law before the people have time to understand its provisions and their effect, or to organize and express their opposition. I sincerely hope our fears are not justified, but in any event, I am sure we can rely on the executive authority to protect the people against hasty and unwise financial legislation. Very respectfully yours, Alfred O. CROZIER. Writer has refused to credit the published reports that the president's mind was being shaped by Mr. Aldrich, and the more serious intimation that the apparently insurmountable opposition to President Taft's nomination in 1908 was overcome by a deal that resulted in the passage of the Aldrich Emergency Currency Bill, then supposed to be killed, the creation of the Monetary Commission with Aldrich at the head and Democrats and Republicans of his selection with him, the sudden change of front in Mr. Taft's favor of the most powerful banks and Wall Street financiers, with the alleged understanding that if nominated and elected, he would be depended upon at the last moment not to veto, but to support the private central bank plan that from the start it has been known the Commission was created to promote. Surely the President was not a party at any such unpatriotic deal, even if it was made. If Mr. MacKenzie, a Democrat, was appointed Secretary of the Treasury at the instance of the promoters of the Aldrich Plan, so that a prominent Democrat would be in position to help fool Andrew Jackson Democrats into believing that the contemplated central bank is not a central bank, of course the President was not aware of the scheme. Knowledge that the special interests never support anyone whom they even doubt, generally know what they are doing, take nothing for granted, exact in advance a most definite and binding arrangement. The fact that the sudden change of such interests at the last moment cinched Mr. Taft's nomination and election, the character of some of his chosen official advisers in the cabinet and in Congress, were all incidents calculated more or less to shake one's confidence and create grave doubts and fears. Hoping against hope, giving the benefit of the doubt, we could only await the raising of the curtain on the final act in the great drama representing the struggle of the people against the interests to discover whether the President, the sworn defender of the Republic, the chief actor, would cast his great influence and official power on the side of the people or their enemies. The complete confidence of Wall Street during the whole of the time since June 1908 that its half-century-long dream of a great central money trust under its control soon would be realized, the formation of side-partner security companies by the big Wall Street banks to buy up control of enough other banks throughout the country to control the proposed National Reserve Association, and many other acts in preparation for the feast of profits and power the monopoly of money and control of all credits would confer, increase the feeling of uncertainty as to the real position of the chief executive of the nation. President Taft at last has officially announced his position in his message to Congress on December 21, 1911, as follows: Monetary reform. A matter of first importance that will come before Congress for action at this session is monetary reform. The Congress has itself arranged an early introduction of this great question through the report of its Monetary Commission. This commission was appointed to recommend a solution of the banking and currency problems so long confronting the nation and furnish the facts and data necessary to enable the Congress to take action. The commission was appointed when an impressive and urgent popular demand for legislative relief suddenly arose out of the distressing situation of the people caused by the deplorable panic of 1907. The Congress decided that while it could not give immediately the relief required, it would provide a commission to furnish the means for prompt action at a later date. In order to do its work with thoroughness and precision, the commission has taken some time to make its report. The country is undoubtedly hoping for a prompt action on the report as the convenience of the Congress can permit. The recognition of the gross imperfections and marked inadequacy of our banking and currency system, even in our most quiet financial periods, is of long standing, and later there has matured a recognition of the fact that our system is responsible for the extraordinary devastation, waste, and business paralysis of our recurring periods of panic. Though the members of the Monetary Commission have for a considerable time been working in the open, and while large numbers of the people have been openly working with them, and while the press has largely noted and discussed this work as it has proceeded, so that the report of the Commission promises to represent a national movement, the details of the report are still being considered. I cannot therefore do much more at this time than commend the immense importance of monetary reform, urge prompt consideration and action when the Commission's report is received, and express my satisfaction that the plan to be proposed promises to embrace main features that, having met the approval of a great preponderance of the practical and professional opinion of the country, are likely to meet equal approval in Congress. It is exceedingly fortunate that the wise and undisputed policy of maintaining unchanged the main features of our banking system rendered it at once impossible to introduce a central bank, for a central bank would certainly have been resisted, and a plan into which it would have been introduced would probably have been defeated. But as a central bank could not be a part of the only plan discussed or considered, that troublesome question is eliminated, and ingenious and novel as the proposed National Reserve Association appears, it simply is a logical outgrowth of what is best in our present system, and is in fact the fulfillment of that system. Exactly how the management of that association should be organized is a question still open. It seems desirable that the banks which should own the association should in the main manage it. It will be an agency of the banks to act for them, and they can be trusted better than anybody else chiefly to conduct it. It is mainly bankers' work, but there must be some form of government supervision and ultimate control, and I favor a reasonable representation of the government in the management. I entertain no fear of the introduction of politics or of any undesirable influences from the properly measured government representation. I trust that all banks of the country possessing the requisite standards will be placed upon a footing of perfect equality of opportunity. Both the national system and the state system should be fairly recognized, leaving them eventually to coalesce if that should prove to be their tendency, but such evolution cannot develop impartially if the banks of one system are given or permitted any advantages of opportunity over those of the other system. And I trust also that the new legislation will carefully and completely protect and assure the individuality and the independence of each bank, to the end that any tendency there may ever be toward a consolidation of the money or banking power of the nation shall be defeated. It will always be possible, of course, to correct any features of the new law which may in practice prove to be unwise, so that while this law is sure to be enacted under conditions of unusual knowledge and authority, it also will include, it is well to remember, the possibility of future amendment. With the present prospects of this long-awaited reform encouraging us, it would be singularly unfortunate if this monetary question should by any chance become a party issue, and I sincerely hope it will not. The exceeding amount of consideration it has received from the people of the nation has been wholly nonpartisan, and the Congress set its nonpartisan seal upon it when the Monetary Commission was appointed. In commending the question to the favorable consideration of Congress, I speak for and in the spirit of the great number of my fellow citizens who, without any doubt of party or partisanship, feel with remarkable earnestness that this reform is necessary for the interests of all people. To avoid any possibility of doing the President injustice, the following letter was sent. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, December 22, 1911. Honorable William Taft, President of the United States, Washington, D.C. Dear Sir, referring to your financial message to Congress of yesterday, kindly advise whether it was your intention thereby to approve specifically or in a general way the Aldrich Plan for a National Reserve Association owned by the banks. Please also advise as to whether you will insist on a clear majority of the directors of such an institution being appointed by the federal government so that the government will have supreme and absolute control of this private corporation. My permanent post office address is care of the Romaine, Middleton Avenue, Clifton, Cincinnati, Ohio. Thanking you, I remain, very respectfully yours, Alfred O. CROZIER. The reply to the above cannot be published because it was marked personal. The language of the President's message, however, leaves no hope that he will oppose the Aldrich Plan or insist on government ownership or any public control that will be effective. And the following quotations from letters published elsewhere in this volume in full are more than significant. They are eloquent. A letter dated December 27, 1911 from the American Bankers Association says, referring to your inquiry about President Taft's attitude, we have no further advices than extracts from the President's message to Congress in which it appears he endorses the Aldrich Plan. The National Bank of Commerce in New York writes on January 3, 1912, the writer has not before him the annual message of President Taft, but his recollection is that the Aldrich Bill was favorably mentioned therein. December 26, 1911. Mr. Alfred O. CROZIER, Plankinton House, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Dear Sir, answering yours of the 22nd, I beg to state that in a recent address, I believe President Taft substantially approved of the Aldrich Plan. I do not know that his approval went to every detail, but I believe it covered the general progress of a Central Reserve Association. I believe it is clear that public opinion is advancing along those lines very rapidly. Very truly yours. The above is conclusive proof that Wall Street and the banks believe the President is definitely with them in the coming contest. They generally know, they do not guess, on matters so vital to their business interests. The recently published statement by Senator Burton said to be a close advisor of the president, his signature to be the Monetary Commission's report, and the warm advocacy of the Aldrich Plan in his annual report of December 4th, 1911, by the Secretary of the Treasury McVie, all indicate that the present administration is committed to the plan of taking away from the government and granting to a private corporation owned by the banks all control of the public currency of the United States. The president argues against consolidation of the money or banking power of the nation, and then favors the Aldrich Plan that would bind all banks into one great money trust by act of Congress. The pending bill permits the Reserve Association to adopt regulations and binds each bank specifically to obey such regulations, present and future. This gives the central bank as much power over all banks as it would have if it owned the entire capital stock of every bank. One has to twice read the president's statement that the National Reserve Association is in no sense a central bank to be certain that it was not intended as one of those famous presidential jokes. Anyway, Wall Street and the banks all had a good laugh over that statement, joke or no joke. The bill reported by the commission, printed herein in full, shows that although for prudential reasons, to fool Andrew Jackson and Democrats, Aldrich named it Reserve Association instead of Central Bank, the corporation is to have all of the ordinary functions, powers, and privileges of European central banks and of the central bank abolished by President Jackson. President Taft, quoting Aldrich and Vreeland in his Boston speech, called it a central bank of issue. There has been no change in the functions of the institution since the New York Chamber of Commerce originated the plan in 1906, elsewhere herein fully described. The only real change was in the form of management. In 1906 it was to be a government central bank with the federal government in supreme control. Now it is a private central bank with the banks in supreme control. Aldrich, to obscure this, has devised a complicated system of branch boards and for electing directors. He calls it a Republican or Democratic form of government, but the people have no hand in it. The banks are the source of all power. If all public officials were elected by vote of the corporations instead of the people, it would be the kind of democracy Aldrich devised, and the president praises for the National Reserve Association. The government of 94 million people chooses 4, and the bank fraternity 42 of the 46 directors of the central bank. The benefits are divided in about the same proportion. It is to be a private corporation with shares of stock, receive deposits, issue notes, have a reserve, loan its credit, discount paper, buy and sell bills of exchange, charge interest, accumulate a surplus, pay dividends. The president surely must have taken Mr. Aldrich's word, for the statement that the National Reserve Association would not be a central bank is untrue and ridiculous. If all banks join it, we'll have over 24,000 depositors. This central bank will do for such customers, the banks, all the things an ordinary bank does for its customers. It is a central instead of an ordinary bank because the banks and the government are to be its only customers. The president seemed to realize that there would be a big fight over the question as to whether control of the institution shall be public or private. The people are certain to resist giving control of their entire money supply into private hands. But President Taft says it seems to be desirable that the banks which would own the association should in the main manage it. It will be an agency of the banks to act for them, and they can be trusted better than anybody else chiefly to conduct it. On page 11 of the published address made by President Aldrich before the Economic Club of New York issued by the Monetary Commission, he said, "The management of the Bank of England is in the hands of 24 directors selected largely from merchants. No bankers, in their sense of the word, being eligible for the position, and these include the governor and deputy governor elected by the directors from their own number, have control of the business of the bank. Here is the greatest central bank in the world, the policy of which largely influences the interest rate, supply of credit, and business conditions not only in the British Empire, but throughout the world, and yet not one banker ever is allowed on its board of directors, or to occupy any position except as a mere hired employee. There is a reason, a fundamental one, that Congress should heed, for that English policy is the result of a century of careful experience. The truth is, the bankers always are on one side, and businessmen on the opposite in the game of finance. The bankers loan, businessmen borrow. Bankers charge interest, businessmen pay it. The banker naturally seeks to increase his profit by increasing interest and other charges, and this increases the burden on business. But the people consumers pay it all, for interest and bank charges are expense included in the cost and increase by at least that much the prices of commodities. Big bankers in a sense are parasites on business. They make all their money that way. Many are good men, honest, fair, and reasonable. Elsewhere herein it is shown that very many are unfair, sordid, dishonest. As a class during all history, their avarice and rapacity has increased with their riches and power. They often take advantage and abuse popular confidence and increase their profits and the public burden when trusted with power and opportunity. This is history. It is the reason banks are barred out of the management of the Bank of England. It is why the good Lord scourged and drove them from the temple. It is why 600 years B.C. Muhammad rebuked and broke with his uncles, the bankers of Mecca, for charging 100% interest, taking the side of the poor, and founding a religion that has now 176 million followers. It is the reason why bankers should not be given by Congress monopolistic control of the public currency with exclusive power to fix the rate of discount, interest, without restraint, that all the people of the country must pay, the power to eliminate all competition for loans, a money trust. The policy of the Bank of England means that over there, businessmen and merchants have more influence than bankers in matters of government and legislation, and therefore they have put a bridle on banks and bankers to make them serve instead of dictate to all business. Because the Bank of England issues the currency and regulates the money supply and interest rates, it is managed exclusively by patriotic businessmen for the common good. They know that if the bankers were in control, money might artificially be made scarce for the very purpose of increasing interest rates, that more profits might be extorted from businessmen by the bankers. To put bankers, or the dummies of bankers, in control of the National Reserve Association is to make it certain that year by year the supply of money and credit will be so manipulated that it will impose upon legitimate business all over the country an ever-increasing interest burden and expense for bank accommodations. It is all right to hire the best of expert bankers to do the technical work, but they should be, as in England, mere employees under the absolute control of a board composed of broad-minded and patriotic businessmen, Republicans and Democrats, from all parts of the country, sworn as public servants. That is the only safe plan. But Aldrich and the President would turn the whole thing, public currency, public revenues, government funds of all kinds, all the money in the United States, over to absolute control of a selfish private banking syndicate, so that no one could get a dollar for any purpose without the consent of the syndicate and on its terms. The President's argument that Congress need not hesitate about adopting the scheme because it does not work well, it can be amended, is like urging a sick patient to swallow the unknown content of a bottle marked poison, because if he doesn't like it and he finds it is likely to kill him, the patient can just simply throw the poison up again. Did Aldrich get the President to insert that clever suggestion, concealing from the Chief Executive the amending clause of the Commission's bill as follows? Section 58. Congress reserves the right to alter or amend the provisions of this act to take effect at the end of any decennial period from and after the organization of the National Reserve Association. Note the absence of the word repeal in the above section. It is nowhere in the bill. Decennial means 10th anniversary. Congress is asked to bind its own hands and shackle the whole country for 10 years, so that during that time the sovereignty of the government is powerless to make any change. It puts the central bank, the money trust, above, independent of, and superior to law, government, the people, for 10 years, and successive periods of 10 years. Before 10 years, the promoters expect this money monster will have attained such political power that thereafter any amendments will be for the benefit of the banks and Wall Street instead of for the people. This provision is typical of the whole bill and reveals the grasping power of the special interests, now bringing pressure on the whole country through the banks and otherwise to force it through Congress. And it strikingly reveals the unpatriotic course of the paid, sworn, and trusted public servants of the Monetary Commission, who seem to be trying to betray the people in the country into the power of the banks and Wall Street. This is the most insolent amending clause ever inserted in a bill introduced into Congress, and the government's paid and sworn Monetary Commission urges its adoption. The first to start the cry of nonpartisanship in the alleged hope of keeping the opponents of the Aldrich Plan divided, while the minority, as a compact balance of power, can be used to terrify both parties and extort unwilling support for the Aldrich Plan in Congress among both Democrats and Republicans, was Paul M. Warburg, partner in the great Wall Street banking house of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, said to represent or do business for Standard Oil and the Rothschilds of Europe. He, as the reputed author of the Aldrich Plan, did this at a meeting in Wall Street of bankers and others held to advance the plan, as elsewhere herein fully shown. Mr. Aldrich took up this Wall Street cry and used it throughout the country, and now the chief executive of the Republic echoes it from the White House of the nation in his official message to Congress. The president's message, however, is even more remarkable for its omissions. When it was written, the president had available the official report of the United States Comptroller of the Currency made on December 4th, 1911. The comptroller, as shown elsewhere here in full, made the most astounding and terrible charges against banks and bankers ever contained in a public document. He showed that over half of all national banks knowingly and constantly break the laws of the United States. He charged bankers wholesale with dishonesty, grafting, and crime. He made his showing from the sworn admissions of the banks themselves on file in his office. He urged Congress to amend the laws, increase the criminal penalties, that he might be better able to enforce the law against the banks for the protection of depositors, borrowers, and the public. Did the president support this request of the comptroller? Did he instruct his attorney general to proceed to enforce the law against bankers officially shown to be law violators? No. But he did, in that message, criticize federal judges for shielding a few grafting clerks of federal courts and urged Congress to enact a law giving power of removal to the president as well as to the judges. Instead of instructing the Department of Justice to prosecute the thousands of rich and powerful criminal bankers, he puts the entire machinery of government to work to discover and punish a mere handfuls of misguided working men, and then urges Congress to turn over to these very lawless bankers for their personal profit the supreme government function of issuing all public currency and the other imperial powers included in the Aldrich Plan. Working men who break law should be punished, but lawless bankers and millionaires should be treated the same way because they have violated the same identical criminal statute, the law of the United States. It is difficult to reconcile the former assertions of the president in his message and public speeches that he proposed to enforce the law, every law against all violators, rich or poor, individual or corporation, labor union or trust, without discrimination, fear or favor, with his apparent indifference to the constant violation of several different provisions of the federal law by thousands of bankers officially accused by the comptroller of the United States. Nor is it due to any oversight or lack of information on the part of the president. Ryder personally put into the president's own hands at the White House on November 16, 1911, 2 weeks before the comptroller's report was made public on December 4, 1911, the written statement herein before, printed in full, which contained the charge, based on evidence privately obtained by Ryder, that the records in the comptroller's office showed that at least 40% of all national banks were constant and intentional lawbreakers. We earnestly wish there was some possible way to explain or excuse this strange course of the president. Whether so intended or not, the conduct of the present administration of government and the law tends to constitute and classify the prosperous and powerful bankers and the Wall Street financiers as a favored class, exempt and above the law, daily treating the laws and authority of government with utter contempt, ignoring their sworn obligations to their depositors, stockholders, and the public, breaking criminal statutes with impunity, and because of the indifference of the Department of Justice or the policy of the executive, enjoying full immunity from penalties or forfeiture, fines, and imprisonment. He has often and well said that in a republic it is dangerous to execute the laws in any but a just, equal, and impartial manner. It cannot be that questions of mere political expediency would induce the learned jurist, the distinguished public servant, the sworn and trusted president to compound with or grant active or passive immunity to lawless bankers as a class, because they are bankers, rich and politically influential, and even to urge Congress now to vastly increase their profits and power by law. As shown in another chapter, there are 40,000 national bank officers and directors this very moment who are guilty under the laws of the United States of the crime of conspiracy, each being liable to a fine not exceeding $10,000 or imprisonment not more than 2 years, or both, and there is ample evidence in the comptroller's office and elsewhere to prove the charge in each case. Yet the Attorney General does not act. The President is silent. Why? Politically speaking, events soon will show that if the President took his stand knowingly, it was suicide. If he was deceived, it was assassination. So long as the special interests get away with the plunder, they waste no tears over the coffin containing the blasted political hopes of careless or faithless public servants whom they have induced to betray the public welfare into their itching hands. Governor Harmon. William J. Bryan says that Judson Harmon, governor of Ohio, is one of the candidates for the Democratic nomination for the presidency, being secretly supported by Wall Street. This may explain why Governor Harmon ignored or did not answer a recent courteous letter by author asking him whether he was in favor of the Aldrich Private Central Bank bill now pending in Congress. Following is the letter. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, December 18, 1911. Governor Judson Harmon, Columbus, Ohio. Dear Sir, the need of wise and practical banking and currency reform now is so important. Kindly advise as to whether you favor the suggested National Reserve Association plan advocated by the National Monetary Commission. Thanking you, I am, very respectfully yours, Alfred Owen CROZIER. End of Appendix Correspondence Part 2. Read by Elsie Selwyn. Section 28 of U.S. Money vs. Corporation Currency, Aldrich Plan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elsie Selwyn. U.S. Money vs. Corporation Currency, Aldrich Plan by Alfred Owen CROZIER. Appendix, Press Notices of the Magnet. Wall Street, Alfred Owen CROZIER's great financial novel, The Magnet, is warmly resented by Wall Street. The book exposes in detail the precise secret methods by which, with the aid of the stock exchange and the ticker, high finance manipulates quotation prices on 20 to 30 billions of listed securities and fleeces the public out of $1 billion each year. Author did not expect or desire Wall Street's approval. In the Magnet scrapbook was found the following letter, which is here reproduced without consultation with the former publisher. Author considers it evidence that the Magnet hit the right mark. New York, January 2nd, 1908. The Funk and Wagnalls Corporation, New York City. Gentlemen, we beg to return you under separate cover the copy of the Magnet which you sent us. We do not think favorably of this work, and not caring to criticize it otherwise in our column, we are sending it back. Thanking you for your courtesy, we remain, yours very truly, the Ticker Publishing Company. The Magnet. Alfred Owen CROZIER's financial novel, The Magnet, has been read by Roosevelt, Taft, La Follette, Bryan, Hughes, and by many congressmen, governors, supreme judges, businessmen, and labor leaders. It was extensively and favorably reviewed by the daily press and magazines. See press notices on the following page. La Follette spent an hour reading extracts from the Magnet to the United States Senate as part of his famous 18-hour speech in 1908. That book was author's first gun in his campaign for honest finance and a progressive and patriotic money policy. It was preliminary in his new volume, U.S. Money vs. Corporation Currency. Book of the Hour. The Magnet is full of fun, thrilling situations, adventures, and tender romance. The women particularly enjoy it. The characters are pat, entertaining, and almost recognizable. Every patriotic man should read it because of the startling and true revelations and exposure in detail of the precise methods being used by Wall Street high finance and its rapid and dangerous conquest of the American Republic. The Magnet was first issued as a high-class $1.50 novel by Funk and Wagnalls Company. The manuscript, written in 1906, was delivered to publisher months before the October 1907 panic, and yet the book contains a full description in detail of that panic and the way it was caused. Its chapter, The Artificial Panic, was surprisingly prophetic. The Magnet Company is publisher of Mr. CROZIER's new work, U.S. Money vs. Corporation Currency. To enable readers of the new book to also obtain the Magnet at a very low cost, the Magnet Company is publisher of Mr. CROZIER's new work, U.S. Money vs. Corporation Currency. To enable readers of the new book to also obtain the Magnet at a very low cost, the Magnet Company has acquired the plates and all rights in the Magnet. These two books, no doubt, will be the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the present progressive crusade for the preservation of popular government and liberation of American business, politics, and banks from the present intolerable bondage to the panic-scourging mastery of Wall Street high finance. U.S. Money vs. Corporation Currency is a powerful book of merciless facts from the official records. The Magnet is a fascinating romance woven about the private central bank scheme that since actually has materialized and now is before Congress. It is flesh and blood in action. It sets forth with startling and convincing realism the alliance between crooked big business and crooked boss politics, and lays bare the shady methods employed. These books were prepared at great cost by authors to post the public and help prepare the people so they could successfully fight to preserve their rights and liberties. Patriotic readers are earnestly asked to help extend their circulation and usefulness, form clubs of 3, so as to get the books at the relatively nominal price, as per special offer to readers set forth on the inside of front cover of this volume. The campaign of 1912 is now on, so kindly act promptly, help start the endless chain. Your own interests are deeply involved in a wise solution of this, the greatest issue since the Civil War. Send orders by mail with P.O. money order to the Magnet Company, Provident Bank Building, Cincinnati, Ohio. Prices: single copy, postpaid. The Magnet, 500 pages, 7 beautiful illustrations, cloth, $1, paper 50 cents. U.S. Money versus Corporation Currency, 400 pages, 34 striking and timely illustrations, and 30 original letters from big banks and financiers, etc. Cloth, 60 cents, paper 30 cents. See special cut price and side front cover, where 3 copies at one time are ordered accompanied by remittance. Baltimore American, an up-to-the-minute novel teeming with the electric thrill of the last sensation in high finance and corporation boodling, The Magnet will justify its title in holding the attention of the reader from start to finish. It is argument in flesh and blood. It is logic in action. It is conviction upon the anvil. Philadelphia North American, one of the most powerful romances which has appeared lately, and which goes to the very root of many of the current national problems. Philadelphia Record, The Magnet is a powerful story. Mr. Crozier writes with humor, originality, and directness, as well with force and lucidity. Boston Globe, rills of humor as sparkling as real rills under the kiss of summer sunshine trickle through and make fascinating the pages of The Magnet. Detroit Free Press, the financial side of this story is treated with an abandon that makes Mr. Lawson's frenzied finance seem mild as milk. Wilmington, Delaware Journal, The Magnet is more than a fascinating romance. It may make its author, Alfred O. CROZIER, of this city a national character. Cleveland Press, Alfred O. CROZIER is the author of The Magnet, a novel in which J. Pierpont Morgan and other familiar figures of Wall Street figure in thin disguise. Cincinnati Post. In obtaining material for his book, Mr. CROZIER spent months studying the hidden currents and sunken wreaths of Wall Street. Wilmington, Delaware Star. Mr. CROZIER thoroughly understands the subject of high finances, which is the underlying subject of The Magnet. Our sympathies are with him in his war with the vampires of the nation, as they were with Lawson, and as they were with Roosevelt, all 3 of whom, by varied methods, some wise and some doubtless unwise, have been valiantly fighting the battle of personal and corporate honesty and of financial, industrial, and commercial cleanliness. Chicago Examiner. Mr. Crozier's new book, The Magnet, though written in story form, bristles with philosophical discussions. Fortunately, Mr. Crozier is not without the saving grace of humor, and some of his severest criticisms are modified by this human touch. Chicago Post. A grave novel of public affairs, this book is beautifully illustrated by Wallace Morgan, the originator of the celebrated Fluffy Ruffles pictures. Washington Times. For 20 years, Mr. Crozier has been a prominent lawyer. He is also a manufacturer with wide business experience and a student of financial and political affairs. For 5 years, he was treasurer of the National Conference of Charities and Corrections of the United States. He started the modern movement for a Delaware ship canal and the Atlantic Coast Inland Waterway from Cape Cod to Carolina. He was an influential delegate at the recent National Rivers and Harbors Congress at Washington and at the Waterways Convention, Philadelphia. Detroit News. The Magnet was written by a former resident of Grand Rapids, Michigan. The story centers in Wall Street, and some of the characters are almost recognizable by their names. Minneapolis Journal. Alfred O. CROZIER, lawyer, manufacturer, and man of wide experience, has given another evidence of his versatility by writing a novel. It is called The Magnet and gives voice to views which caused something of a sensation at a recent meeting of the National Civic Federation. Detroit Times. The Magnet by Alfred O. CROZIER is a powerful and fascinating romance interspersed with philosophic humor. St. Louis Republic. The Magnet by Alfred O. CROZIER should find many readers. It is a romance of the battlefields of modern financial giants, great financial matters being dovetailed into a pretty love story. The book is written in a new and original style and is designed to appeal to the serious minds of all thoughtful Americans. Cleveland Leader. The Magnet by Alfred Owen CROZIER is certainly one of the most appropriate books for the times. At a time when the country has been suffering from a lack of currency, it is interesting to read an account of how one man was able to get all the gold under lock and key and actually get his hands on so nearly all of the rest of the currency that the country was nearly frenzied. Of course, it all became a grand problem for the President, Cabinet, and Congress to struggle with. The metaphysical struggle with Sterling Morton, the man who actually cornered the money, is better read than described. There is an interesting love story running through the book. Augusta, Maine, Herald. One of the most conspicuous publications of the hour is the new novel by Mr. CROZIER, which is in reality an arraignment of the evil forces at work in Wall Street. Chicago Tribune. Mr. Alfred Owen CROZIER, an attorney of Wilmington, Delaware, has written a novel called The Magnet, which attacks Wall Street and its methods. Mr. CROZIER is the member of the Civic Federation who so badly baited August Belmont at the meeting in New York a month or so ago. Kansas City Star. The Magnet is by Alfred Owen CROZIER, a distinguished lawyer of Wilmington, Delaware, who has decided views on Wall Street's panic-making machine and other manifestations of modern finance. Grand Rapids, Michigan Herald. Mr. CROZIER has studied his subject from several viewpoints. It should be read to be appreciated, for an outline of the plot does not give the fullness of the tale. Seattle, Washington Post Intelligencer. Mr. CROZIER has written a polemical novel whose ideas may be gleaned as follows. Congress should go slow on currency legislation. The recent artificial panic was to scare the country into forcing Congress to act quickly and blindly. Selfishness instead of patriotism seems to be the inspiration of every proposition emanating from banking sources. They want elasticity, a rubber currency. This means simply the power to expand and contract the volume of money. But in every plan the banks demand the exclusive right to exercise this dangerous power. They are unwilling to let the people's government have any say. Mr. CROZIER is much in earnest and very zealous. New York Sun. There is a passage in The Magnet describing Wall Street at page 55 which makes us think that Mr. W. J. Bryan must have read the book before making his speech at Carnegie Hall last Tuesday evening. Montreal, Canada Witness. The Magnet cannot fail to arouse at least a determination to discover how much of truth is contained in its vigorous and fearless denunciations. St. Louis Christian Advocate. The Magnet is a book of 497 pages, and in matters a strongly written romance, really thrilling in many of its scenes and incidents. It is intended to expose the crooked ways that mark the methods of Wall Street and corporations generally, and in a powerful climax, shows what may come to pass under existing conditions. We recommend the book as worthy. Brooklyn Eagle. Mr. CROZIER is a lawyer of Wilmington, Delaware, and a student of finance. He certainly knows Wall Street in all its ramifications and is not afraid to speak out against it, as he proved about a month ago when he attacked high rates of interest in margin gambling at a meeting of the National Civic Federation. Dallas, Texas News. The serious-minded will feel repaid to plod through The Magnet for the unquestionable value of its revelations. It strips naked that hideous panic-making agency, the destroyer of confidence and credit, the wrecker of fortunes and happiness, the enemy of society, humanity, and the Republic. Wall Street. Cleveland Town Topics. No other work of fiction will be published within the 12 months which will prove so absorbing, so powerful, so revealing, which will touch so boldly upon so vital a subject as The Magnet. It is a book which deals with financial problems and with no weak or uncertain touch. There has been no hesitancy in the mind of the man who wrote it, no hedging of facts, no cringing to the powers that be. Those who enjoy fiction of the highest class and of the most absorbing interest should read this book. Having once opened it, they will become bound by its spell. New York World. Our novelist, Mr. CROZIER, sets out to popularize the arguments against the Wall Street gamble, and he does this with eloquence and force. Louisville, Kentucky Western Record. The Magnet was an agreeable surprise. The story is one of great interest. One's attention is closely held, yet the indictment against many of the methods of modern finances is strong and clearly put, so that the average man who knows little of these things can understand. How Mr. CROZIER managed to make such an absorbing story out of his dry and unpleasant facts remains a mystery. Madison, Wisconsin Journal. The evils of Wall Street gambling, elastic currency schemes, political conspiracies, etc. are laid bare in a new novel by Alfred Owen CROZIER. Many of the reforms urged by President Roosevelt in his last message to Congress were previously incorporated in this book. Charleston, South Carolina News and Courier. In his book, Mr. CROZIER has written in a powerful and fascinating way about a question of intense practical moment, weaving into his romance a great deal of delightful philosophic humor, and telling the story in a new and most original way of the conditions which so nearly affect not only the business life of the country, but its social and domestic happiness as well. Omaha World Herald. The author of The Magnet states that he has written the book with the hope that it may induce public thought and discussion, and thus do some good by helping to defeat the designs of lawless and incorporated wealth. Portland Oregonian. The Magnet is a cleverly constructed, audacious novel. Albany, New York, Argus. Mr. CROZIER has been creating sensations in financial circles and columns of interests and the newspapers with his radical views on Wall Street and the worship of the gold in California. The Banker, Chicago. The recent Boston address before the City Club on banking topics by Alfred Owen CROZIER has attracted attention anew to his powerful novel The Magnet. CROZIER is a born enemy of the trusts, and his fighting blood was up, a la Sterling, when he wrote this wonderful story of Sterling the promoter, Helen Morton, and John Hayes. As a description of a venture in high finance, it is worthy of a place in any library. It teaches a useful lesson for those who risk all for money. The plot and counterplot are clever, with a grand climax and a moral victory to conclude. Buy it and read it. Des Moines, Iowa, Register and Leader. The Magnet is a delight to the jaded reader who has wearied of the conventional and purposeless drivel which seems to have usurped the romantic market. Mr. CROZIER, first of all, writes with a defined object in view. His theme is drawn from important public questions of today. Glasgow, Scotland News. Read in the light of the recent money crisis in the United States, The Magnet is well calculated to cause grave searchings of heart among those who realize how much of the world's future is bound up with the developments, political and financial, of that country. It is decidedly dry reading, but it is deeply instructive. Indianapolis News. The author of The Magnet possesses a great mass of useful and timely information. Milwaukee Sentinel. The Magnet by Alfred Owen CROZIER is a powerful novel dealing with current affairs, containing a fascinating romance, and illustrated by Wallace Morgan. Dayton, Ohio Watchword. Whether the resignation of General DuPont as head of the Speaker's Bureau of the Republican National Committee was voluntary or was forced by President Roosevelt will probably remain a secret. In this connection, however, it is significant that a few days previous to the general's resignation, President Roosevelt received a communication from Alfred Owen CROZIER, the Wilmington lawyer whose book The Magnet has caused such a sensation in political and financial circles. He called attention to the serious handicap that General DuPont's presence upon the executive committee was likely to exert upon Mr. Taft's election. Detroit Advocate. The author has original views on various subjects. It will set one thinking to read Mr. CROZIER's book. New York Christian Herald. The Magnet is a timely romance of the battles of modern business giants and the fatuity of living merely to accumulate material riches. London, England Globe. The Magnet by A. O. CROZIER comes from America and proves to be yet another novel lustily lashing the transatlantic overweening craze for making money by any means, honest or dishonest, and showing how it demoralizes the national character. American financiers and other worshippers of the almighty dollar have no lack of mirrors in which to see their unlovely selves. The story ends with a novel act of restitution. Detroit Times. The Magnet is certain to attract attention and make its impress on the coming national campaign. Colorado Springs Gazette. Unlike Lawson, CROZIER is not a speculator, and his insight into Wall Street affairs has not been gained in a rough-and-tumble mix-up in the battles of the street. He has rather been the attitude of the student and the investigator. For years he has studied the game as it is played, until the study has become his hobby, his passion. He fairly oozes statistics. To illustrate the accuracy of his knowledge of the trend of banking and currency affairs, one of the chapters in his novel The Magnet, although written more than a year ago, describes with remarkable fidelity the recent money panic, giving in detail, months in advance of their actual occurrence, many of the facts which are now a part of current financial history. Portland Bulletin. The characters in the story are splendidly portrayed and reveal some excellent word drawings on the part of the author. The private schemes in Congress regarding elastic currency are laid bare. The methods and powers of Wall Street are exposed. The author of The Magnet tells how panics are created and their effect. He also tells of methods regarding the regulation of railroads and trusts and other kindred subjects. This book is well worth perusal, not merely for its romance, but for its timeliness insofar as present political and industrial conditions are concerned. Syracuse Herald. Mr. CROZIER has written a novel of modern business in which men talk in billions, and the merger has been carried to the ultimate. The author says the book is not a reservoir of pansies, but he hopes it may induce public thought. San Francisco Newsletter. At close range, Mr. Lawson may present a prettier picture to the eye, his graces of person, his immaculate taste in dress, with its touch of the aesthetic, and the always conspicuous boutonniere being well known, but when it comes right down to physical bulk, CROZIER makes an impressive eyeful. He is a fair specimen of what we have come to expect a fighter should look like. When standing on the ground, he stretches in straight, solid fashion, nearly standing 6 feet into the air. The scale would probably register his weight at 225 pounds. His hair, surmounted with a stiff growth of that peculiar copper wire hair which we are wont to associate with unusual physical strength, tops off a face that is as grim and relentless as a Pilgrim Father's, 2 lean, muscular jaws jutting away like the sides of a gunboat from a somewhat long and inquisitive nose, terminate in a firm and knotty chin. In platform speech, these jaws snap shut at impressive intervals, and it is then that the man's strength and fixity of purpose is revealed at its best. A close friend says his eyes are gray. Perhaps they are, but if so, they are the coldest, steeliest pair of gray eyes ever set in a man's head. If you or me were to be pulled suddenly from a dark room into the light, our eyes would blink and blur until they become accustomed to the changed condition. Perhaps CROZIER's eyes would act likewise, but they do not convey that impression. They strike one as eyes that would gaze at you steadily and unblinkingly under almost any conditions. Boston Globe. The Magnet is the magic and attractive title of an up-to-the-minute novel by Alfred Owen CROZIER, published by Funk and Wagnall's Company. In a style which holds the interest of the reader from beginning to end, the author deals in a logical, convincing, and entertaining way with high finance and boodling. New York Christian Observer. In this novel, The Magnet, of nearly 500 pages, the machinery of Wall Street is uncovered to the public eye, revealing its diabolical methods and the tragedies that result. Fourth Estate, New York. The Magnet is a book of 500 pages, so magnetic, so fascinating, that the reader, having once begun it, will not be ready to lay it aside until he has finished it. The story is one of so-called high finance, related in a captivating style. An overwhelming desire to secure the power which wealth is supposed to give possesses a man of apparently strong character, who is described as playing a desperate game to obtain the control of national finance. Love, hatred, fear, intrigue, and other passions skillfully interwoven play their parts. Fortunately, love gains the ascendancy over the greed for gold, and a moral victory is won. Traits of American life and manners are graphically pictured in this romance of the battle of giants that figure on modern finance. New York Commercial. Mr. CROZIER lives in Wilmington, Delaware, as a well-known lawyer and is also a successful manufacturer. He is intensely in earnest, and this very earnestness gives him a poise and ease of demeanor that never desert him, even under trying circumstances. During the recent meeting of the National Civic Federation in New York, at which was present Andrew Carnegie, August Belmont, Seth Low, Samuel Gompers, and scores of other notable figures in American public life, the discussion had ambled along in a dignified and orderly, if somewhat desultory manner, until near the close of the meeting, when CROZIER slowly arose from his seat, and in his characteristic way fired a question at Belmont. The question was simple in itself, but it was not just the kind of question that members of that august body were accustomed to have put so bluntly, and it created a stir. A battery of well-bred stares was focused in CROZIER's direction, but it did not quail him. He serenely waited his answer, and he got it. The incident is characteristic of the man. He impresses you as one who will get what he goes after. Although not endorsing all the conclusions reached by Mr. CROZIER, President Roosevelt, with whom Mr. CROZIER has conversed on the subject uppermost in his mind, is following a similar line of reasoning, as is evidenced in the President's recent remarkable special message to Congress. New York American. Alfred Owen CROZIER, the big Wilmington, Delaware lawyer who furnished the 3 explosions which made the recent convention of the National Civic Federation the liveliest in its history, did not speak his whole mind on the sins of Wall Street and capital in the Federation session. On Monday, he chastised Wall Street as a panic-making machine and made some of the big financiers present squirm. Tuesday, he stood up August Belmont on the charge of capitalizing franchises and wrung from him his first public defense of the Interbureau Metropolitan merger. He then tried to inject a saving clause into the elastic currency resolution proposed by Isaac N. Selwyn. Since he startled the staid Civic Federation, there has been no little curiosity as to just who CROZIER is. He comes from New York stock and was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He graduated from the University of Michigan in 1886 and has been a lawyer for 20 years. San Francisco Call. In the opening chapter of The Magnet, which antedates the story about 30 years, the upbuilding of the plot is well outlined. New York Tribune. Alfred Owen CROZIER, the Delaware delegate to the National Civic Federation, who was appointed to draw up resolutions of thanks to retiring President August Belmont, together with Isaac N. Seligman, after he had tilted with both of them at Monday's and Tuesday's meetings, is anxious to bring about an organized effort to do away with margin sales and call loans at exorbitant rates of interest. Mr. CROZIER said last evening that only by these means did he think that panicky conditions could be securely guarded against. New York World. A bomb was dropped into the placid councils of the National Civic Federation yesterday, and the echo of its explosion had not ceased to reverberate at the annual dinner held last night at Hotel Astor. The man who had the temerity to raise this storm was Alfred Owen CROZIER of Wilmington, Delaware, a lawyer, and the author of The Magnet, a book attacking Wall Street. Face to face, he told the financiers they caused the money panic. New York Herald. August Belmont, chairman of the boards of directors controlling the surface lines and traction facilities above and beneath the earth in New York City, made the longest impromptu speech of his life yesterday in defending traction companies and mergers. He took the position that, since the obligation to operate cars was laid so heavily upon the corporation, the employee also should be made to feel, when he accepted a position with the transportation company, that he was in the service of the public and should not be permitted to leave his post without notice. Mr. Belmont, added Mr. CROZIER, if an employee entering the employment of a public service corporation at a modest wage thereby incurs an obligation as a servant of the public, should not the corporation which receives the franchise from the public free, a franchise which is not property but a mere license, should it not also have an obligation to the public and be prevented from capitalizing that franchise for $100 million and then charging the public higher rates so as to pay dividends on such capitalization? Mr. Belmont was astonished by the long, hypothetical inquiry, and a wave of red swept over his face. Some of the labor element in the room applauded Mr. CROZIER. Many more press notices from other leading papers and magazines and strong endorsements of the Magnet by men prominent in public life could be given, but space will not permit. To many, Mr. CROZIER seems to be an extreme radical, but the fact is he is a cautious and careful conservative. His radicalism is only the radicalism of naked truth, which he states bluntly and always without qualification or apology. He believes the time to temporize with dangerous national evils has passed, and that the only way to prevent the swing of the pendulum to a dangerous extreme is to quickly establish justice and a square deal in finance, business, and politics, in between capital and labor. That is all he seeks. He would not harm any legitimate business, big or little, not even that of Wall Street, but he thinks the only way to safeguard legitimate business is to destroy the evils. Mr. CROZIER and the family went to Cincinnati, Ohio, because of the unsurpassed school system of that city, and that his 2 daughters might complete their education in the splendid university and art school of that town. He also has established there the headquarters of his cement products company that supplies special machinery and erects plants for the manufacture of brick with ordinary wet process cement concrete under the CROZIER system, of which he is inventor and principal owner, the product being known as crozite, stone and brick. But for years, Mr. CROZIER constantly has pushed the nonpartisan progressive campaign for the preservation of popular rule and to retain in the people and their government control of the country's supply of money. He has freely and gladly expended very many thousands of dollars and years of time and personal effort in making the investigations and collecting the information now made public for the common good. The relatively nominal price put on his new book has been made possible by him. If Congress, instead of adopting the Aldrich Plan, will take up the CROZIER Plan for a U.S. Monetary Council, it will prove a great and lasting national blessing. The Magnet Company. End of Appendix Press Notices of the Magnet. Recording by Elsie Selwyn. End of U.S. Money versus Corporation Currency Aldrich Plan by Alfred Owen CROZIER.